Hello, and welcome to part 2 of these little talks brought to you by the Friends of the Wembdon Road Cemetery and the Blake Museum. In this talk we'll be looking at the history of burial in Bridgwater from the Reformation in the 1530s up to the 1830s. The last time we looked at about 1,000 years of history. This time we'll just be looking at 300 years, although we've got a lot more information to play with. As always, you can support the Friends by visiting our website, bridgewatercemeteries.org.uk. You can like this video, you can follow us on Facebook, and it really helps if you become a member of the Friends. So, let's jump straight to it. Last time, we dealt very broadly with medieval religion. Well, everything changed in the 16th century when the Reformation came. This is when Henry VIII broke away from the Roman Catholic Church and the authority of the Pope in Rome, and he adopted a new form of worship based upon Protestantism. He also closed down all the monasteries and friaries, which included Bridgwater St John's Hospital and the Franciscan Friary. We'll leave aside most aspects of doctrine in this video, aside from the relevant basics, to massively oversimplify for our purposes. In terms of worship, the old Catholic Church was fundamentally based around ritual and sensory experience, along with centuries of developed traditions, while the new Protestant churches wanted to focus on the Word and a stricter adherence on the core text of the Bible, doing away with all the accumulations of centuries of tradition that they couldn't find in the text of the Bible. The Church of England, as it eventually emerged, ended up blending aspects of both of these systems, but was wholly Protestant. Overall, though, for our purposes, in many ways the religious changes revolutionized attitudes towards death. Purgatory was completely done away with, and the saints were also done away with. And in this new take on Christianity, there was a finality about death, so you could no longer interact with the dead as you had before. In this system, or at least the Calvinism that parts of it were based on, God had already decided who was saved or not, so it didn't matter what you did in this life. The living could no longer interact with the dead, your prayers could no longer help your ancestors, and they could no longer help you. We can see something in the change of attitudes towards death through memorials. And in one aspect, the Reformation seemed to bring the dead to life. So before the Reformation, tombs tended to look something like this, at least tombs for rich people. However, after the Reformation, they seemed to sit up and stare directly at you. This, to my mind, is the finest piece of art in Bridgwater, the beautiful alabaster memorial to Francis Kingsmill, who died in 1620. He was an Irish-English adventurer who mostly campaigned for Queen Elizabeth in Ireland, who for reasons lost to history ended up in Bridgwater. You can see his two sons praying behind him, and the reclining pose he's adopted there is meant to represent the biblical Jesse, who was the father of King David and was at the root of Christ's family tree. You can see there's a lot in medieval art, and he would have had a baton in his hand there, which sadly looks like he's holding his thumbs up today. Kingsmill is buried in front of the statue here, and presumably his two sons are too. Although burial no longer had any spiritual relevance to people after the Reformation, a fancy tomb could still command a hearty amount of social prestige, hence lots of money would be spent on something like this. Kingsmill, or his sons, also paid a lot of money to be buried in the fanciest part of the church here, in the chancel. Although there was no spiritual benefit to be buried in such a fancy location, it still carried an awful lot of prestige. The entire footprint of St Mary's Church is filled with burial vaults below the floor, which is why there are so many memorial slabs around the edges. All these burial vaults were for the rich and powerful of Bridgwater. The ordinary people would still be buried in the churchyard, and they would still be buried in exactly the same way we saw in the Middle Ages. So they'll be buried, and eventually they'll be dug up, and their bones would ultimately end up in the charnel house on the north side of the church. So for most ordinary people, despite the revolutionary changes in devotional belief, the practical matter of burial carried on as it did before, although now there was only one burial site in the town instead of 3. However, there were almost certainly 2 additional emergency burial grounds, at least 2, somewhere under the town. Along with multiple other epidemics over the centuries, Tony Woolrich has found evidence for a terrible outbreak of plague in 1565 to 1566, which resulted in around 500 deaths in the space of a year. These could not have been accommodated in St Mary's Churchyard. There's simply not enough space. Keeping in mind the town had a population of around 3,500 people, or at least that's what we know there was in 1801, this would have been a huge proportion of the town's population. They needed to be buried somewhere, we simply have no idea where. Likewise, in 1645, hundreds of people, mostly soldiers, were killed during the Civil Wars, when the Parliamentary Army of Sir Thomas Fairfax stormed into the town to dislodge the Royalist garrison. A lot of the town was burnt at the same time, and again, so many people were killed in this episode that they simply could not have been buried in St Mary's churches. So we know on both of these occasions that hundreds of people died, we just don't know yet where they were buried. The most important change in burial practice came in 1688. This was when it became legal to set up dissenting or nonconformist churches. Now these are all Protestant churches, which essentially meant they're all not Catholic, but they all disagreed with the teachings and practices of the Church of England, which is seen as a fudge between Protestant and Catholic. These little congregations set up their own little burial grounds. The important thing about their burial grounds was that they were not consecrated. Consecration was the act of making land holy and had survived the Reformation in the Church of England. But hardline dissenters said that this was essentially crypto-Catholicism and just superstition. So if we start with our map of Bridgwater, we can overlay the known medieval burial grounds we looked at last time. So St Mary's Church, St John's Hospital, the Friary, the supposed Jews' churchyard in Kidsbury, the Castle burial ground, and the burials in Mansion House Lane. We can now go through each post-Reformation burial ground as they were established. The oldest dissenting church in Bridgwater is the Unitarian Chapel in Dampier Street. This meeting house was established in 1688-1689 and was initially Presbyterian before morphing into Unitarian by 1815. They had a burial ground behind the chapel, which is now covered over by the schoolroom at the back. The amount of space was eventually used up, and a second burial ground was established by 1835. I'll come to that later. You can still see quite a few memorials in the chapel and in the schoolroom behind. As an aside, when all this is over, do pop in, especially when they hold their regular coffee mornings. The inside of the chapel is one of the most peaceful and beautiful spaces in the town, and a real architectural gem. I don't have a photograph to do it justice, just go and visit when you have the opportunity. Next, we have the Baptist Chapel in St Mary's Street, which was first built in that location in 1692, although rebuilt in 1837 in favour of the current building. A burial ground may have been established not long after 1692, although it may have only begun in the 1830s during the rebuild. Either way, burials seem to have taken place in the patch of ground in front of the chapel, now taken up by the little car park. 5 memorials on the outside survive along the lane to the side of the chapel, although most of the inscriptions are badly worn. The burial ground was closed by Act of Parliament in 1854. Again, if you get the chance to visit after the lockdown ends, do pop by for a visit if you get the chance. Next is one of the few burial grounds to survive, alongside the adjoining Wesleyan burial ground, which now makes up part of the open site on the corner of the Broadway and Albert Street. This belonged to the Society of Friends, who are popularly known as the Quakers, and this was established in 1821, which is about the same time they established a meeting house in Friarn Street. There are 74 known burials here, although there was probably about double this number, as records don't really survive for the 18th century. We just have those for the 19th. The last known burial was in 1917, although there may have been a couple afterwards which haven't survived in the paperwork. Incidentally, a transcription of all the known burials is published in the members section of the website of the Friends of the Wembdon Road Cemetery. There's some quite interesting people buried here, the most remarkable probably being a man called John Clark, who was an inventor, and he built a very bizarre machine which could generate Latin poems, which was a very early form of computer. I might take the chance to talk about him more in a later talk. Most of the Quaker burials in this ground were marked out with little slabs like this one, although all the remaining ones have been moved to a corner of the adjoining Wesleyan burial ground. The Quaker site was transferred to the Bridgwater Borough Council in 1935, and a strip of land was cut away to widen Albert Street. The Quaker ground and the adjoining Wesleyan ground are the only dissenting burial grounds on this list that haven't been dug up, built over, or turned into a car park. which is something of an irony, as the Quakers are the ones who care the least about death, or at least the dead body. For them, the dead body is nothing more than a cell, which should be buried with as little fuss or as pomp as possible. This is why the Quakers tend to be so keen to give their bodies up for medical science. The Quaker congregation of Bridgwater even asked the borough council to turn this into a play park for children, although this was forbidden by the terms of the transfer of the adjoining Wesleyan burial ground. Next, we move a little way round the road to Friarn Street to the site of the Zion Independent Chapel, which was established in 1822. This was a congregation known as the Independents or Congregationalists, and they moved out of this building in 1864 to the 4th Street, but they kept this building as a schoolroom, although it eventually became taken over by the Salvation Army. There were 265 burials recorded in this site. The last known burial was in 1859. All the burials have now been apparently removed in advance of building work, but I'll return to this story. Next, we have the Wesleyan Methodist burial ground, which is in Albert Street and adjoined the Quaker burial ground already mentioned. The Wesleyan Methodists had their chapel in King Street, which was built in 1816 and is now flats. We know that burials seem to have been taking place in this ground from about 1830. Unfortunately, complete records for the burial ground do not seem to survive, and only scraps of information relating to the period 1830 to 1879 are preserved, despite clear evidence for burials after this date, even as late as 1912 and possibly beyond. Up to 1879 there were about 142 known burials, when roughly half the land was used up. In total, we may assume about 300 burials in a small plot of land in total. Like the Quaker memorials, the Wesleyan tombs have all been moved into one corner, but they tend to be the larger slabs, although there are a couple of tombstones as well, although most of the memorials were removed by the council. This ground was transferred to the Borough Council in 1941, and in 1960 the council combined the Quaker and Wesleyan ground and spent a lot of money rebuilding the walls around the site to how we see it today. Keeping in the same area of town, in 1835 we have the second Unitarian burial ground, which was in Friarn Street. When room behind their chapel in Dampier Street was largely used up, a second burial ground was established in Friarn Street behind the house where the minister lived up to about 1850. This burial ground seems to have closed in 1854 by Act of Parliament. The site is possibly later used as a school, although by 1880 it was in use as a drill hall for the local volunteer regiment. In more recent times, this was the old Armory garage, which was rebuilt in about the 2000s. Apparently a number of tombstones could still be seen when the building was in use as a garage. Presumably the burials are still there. I've not found any record for them having been dug up, but they may have been removed for the garage petrol pumps or for the car park which is now there. It's not entirely clear. Next we move across town to St John Street and the site of the old Mariners' Chapel. The burial ground was presumably laid out in 1837 when the chapel was built. We only know about it from being closed down in 1854 by Act of Parliament. We find its location on the 1880s Ordnance Survey map, and the site is now used as a little car park at the back of the building. Unfortunately, no burial register survives at all, meaning we have absolutely no idea of who is buried there, how many people are buried there. We only know there must be some, and that they're still probably there under the tarmac. Moving across town now, we have Holy Trinity Church at the bottom of Taunton Road, which was established in 1839, and this is the first Church of England site to have been established after the Reformation. Essentially, by the 1830s, St Mary's Church didn't have enough room to seat the congregation of the parish, so a new parish was eventually created. The site is now a piece of open ground at the junction of the Broadway, although the congregation is now moved into the Hamp area. There were 79 burials in total in this piece of ground before the churchyard was closed by Act of Parliament in 1854. Having been essentially illegal in Britain for a number of centuries, by 1827 Roman Catholicism was at last allowed to re-establish itself in Britain. In 1846, a Roman Catholic chapel was built off of St John Street in Gordon Terrace by the Reverend Capes, who had spent the preceding few years organising and building St John's Church in Eastover, which is Church of England, but he had suddenly converted to Roman Catholicism and built himself a small chapel. Roman Catholics having previously had to go all the way to Cannington to worship. The small amount of land around this chapel was used for burial, and we even have the names of a few people buried there, such as Sergeant James Hogan, whose obituary was recently transcribed by Tony Rulrich, and I'll leave a link in the description for you to read this. In 1882, the new Roman Catholic chapel in Binford Place was established, which is still in use today. In total, there were around 130 recorded burials in Gordon Terrace, the last being about 1890. 20 burials there were excavated in 2001 when the site was being developed, and I get the impression that the rest of the burials below the water table, which couldn't be excavated, were removed by other means. The bones were all at least reburied in St John's Cemetery. Again, I'll return to this in a later episode. Finally, in our survey is St John's Parish Church in 1846. This was Reverend Capes' first grand design, and here we see it in 1865 with the Reverend Collins and his wife before the pinnacles were added to the tower. So this concludes our survey of the post-Reformation burial grounds of Bridgwater. Part of the reason for this exercise is just to demonstrate to you how much of Bridgwater is built upon old burial ground, and there's probably even more that we don't even know about. I'll return to the problem of what happens to these burial grounds at a later time, so we'll conclude things here. Next time we'll be looking at the burial crisis in Bridgwater in the 1840s. Before I go, if you enjoyed this video, you can support the Friends by liking, subscribing, and by visiting the membership page on our website and signing up. Again, link in the description below. We also have a book published, Bridgwater in the First World War, and a little booklet, A Short Walk in the Wembdon Road Cemetery, and I'll include links to these in the description below. Purchasing these really helps our efforts. In the meantime, wishing you all the very best, and see you soon.